Hello, everyone. Welcome to Feedstuffs 365. I'm Sarah Muirhead. Back with us today is meteorologist Greg Soulje. Welcome, Greg. Nice to see you again. Greg might look familiar to some of you. He's on This Week in Agribusiness every weekend on RFD, and of course, you've seen him here before. So, hope all is well with you.
We're doing well here on a somewhat marginally cool, rainy day over parts of the Midwest. What else is new so far this springtime season? But we're doing well and certainly hope you're the same, Sarah.
Yeah, doing great. Those of you that are joining us today online, we hope that you're doing well as well, and that you take time to put some questions in the chat there for Greg. You can put them in the chat area on your screen. You can also post them right in social media, and we can see those and get those to Greg. So, Greg, I've been seeing a few reports here this week on the big transition to La Nina and the saying goodbye to El Nino. Is that where you're at on this too?
Yeah, the process is getting underway. Again, we've talked about this before. It's not like throwing a light switch and voila, here we are to a neutral state to atmosphere and ocean situation, ocean temperature situation, and we're into La Nina. It takes months. The atmosphere obviously is while it is an instantaneous, weather is an instantaneous event, it takes a while for the atmosphere to catch up. As we've talked about before, the planet made up of about 75% water. So there's a correlation, but again, it takes a while. Typically, on average, from the literature, and it doesn't hold true all the time, 4, 5, 6 months. So that process, by the way, winding out of El Nino is underway. So here we are in mid to late April, and yeah, it may take until mid to late summertime, and we'll have a couple of thoughts about that later on in the broadcast here on how the correlation from El Nino to neutral state to La Nina, which is something we'll look forward to late summer, early autumn, will play out with crops and probably more importantly, the harvest season. I think that'll be the greater impact in going into the fall season next year.
We always like to start by talking about drought. What is the situation? Have we seen any improvements?
We've seen significant improvement. Matter of fact, we'll kind of do a comparison for you here, leading things off back in December, because this was sort of the crux of it all, as in just horrible drought conditions, not only as they apply to the western and southwestern Corn Belt locales. And yeah, a lot of folks out there still testifying to that. Heard from a radio colleague down out of Jefferson City, Missouri this morning, and thank goodness they got rain down there. They are ahead of the game big time with corn and some soybean planting in that northern and central mid-Missouri Valley sections of Missouri. They need rain, and they got some rain. Not a lot, not great coverages, but you can see as of early December there in eastern Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas, just a tough go of it. Same with the desert Southwest, parts of Texas, but really for areas into the Delta region, Louisiana in particular. I believe last year there was virtually nothing that came out in the sugarcane department because of the drought and just phenomenal water temperatures off the northern sections of the Gulf of Mexico. So that was December of this past year of 2023. Then we jump forward here to last week's drought monitor on the 16th. Wow, big improvement to a point where there were some field work, and there's still some mid-season field work delays in the sections of the lower Mississippi Valley, Louisiana, Mississippi. Boy, look at that improvement. It's gone. The drought, they've literally gone from a drought to a flood. Just a couple of weeks ago, of course, they had some 5 to 10 inch rains into eastern Texas, parts of Louisiana, Mississippi, and that's translated on east. They've had a little bit of frost, by the way, in some of these areas of the southeast that have had an accelerated start to the growing season, flowering trees, ornamentals, etc., so forth and so on. Then you get a little closer to home across the heartland into the western and southwestern Corn Belt. Yeah, some categorical improvement, probably just some topsoil recharge in areas of Nebraska, Kansas, and Oklahoma. Matter of fact, this morning's report from the USDA here as of the 23rd of April, there's been some worsening of some of the winter wheat quality. It's generally perceived that winter wheat is better in the plain states. The conditions, and it has been, but the conditions itself have declined a little bit because of lack of organized rains in Kansas and parts of Oklahoma the past 2 or 3 weeks. And you can see into parts of eastern Iowa, still ongoing. The worst of it around Ankeny, Des Moines, Cedar Rapids, just to name a few, those red areas of extreme drought. So better, not great. And of course, we're still in concern mode for Montana. the Dakotas, especially the southern Canadian prairie and up through the arrowhead of Minnesota, some of those sugar beety areas, there is no sign of any flooding. They get a typical normal flood in that Red River Valley of the North Basin. Not going to happen this year. Sarah brings up a couple of points that because of the ongoing dryness and drought in the Canadian prairie, fires may come back into play. And usually a winding down of El Nino is not conducive to getting organized rains in the southern Canadian prairie, the northern plains. And there are still some reports up in that boreal forest region. I know there's no ag that goes on there. There is absolutely no cattle or livestock. Canadian boreal region, still some local fires that are still burning since summertime there that they're still trying to contain. So I think this may be a story that comes back here later on the season as in dryness, drought, and fires as you get into the Canadian prairie.
Oh, good. We get that smoke like we had last time, right?
Great,
last year.
yeah, great sunrise and sunsets. But and I saw some social media tweets and ticks on folks trying to put together research on how the lack of full sun, full insulation on some of those summer crops behave. Was there any yield loss? I haven't really got into a point. I don't think anyone has from a research standpoint, but it's something to keep an eye out for here later this season on maybe some diminished direct sun, but again, brilliant sunrise and sunsets.
Got some guys in the field here in northern Illinois I saw this weekend.
Good.
I don't know if it's too early or what that soil temp is like, but we're seeing it.
It's a little bit early for northern Illinois, central and southern Illinois, Indiana, kind of that central and southern Corn Belt locale. Yeah, we're about there. Typically, they like to hit the ground running somewhere in that first week of May, and it is. I've heard some folks getting a little worked up, and especially Indiana and Ohio. I think latest heard and read that the topsoil moisture levels were running at like 50 to 70% surplus there. Meanwhile, 35 to 50% deficits in the topsoil moisture reserves in those western Corn Belt areas. I think it's 12% of corn to the ground in Missouri, 8% in of beans. Everyone else is, still waiting to go over the rest of the northern and eastern Corn Belt.
What else you got for us?
Well, on we go here to the maps and charts. Actually, this is the back end of at least the seasonal drought outlook that the feds put together, the National Weather Service, NOAA, and this obviously came out back in the mid to late March timeframe. So here we are, kind of mid-forecast cycle. It's a 90-day cycle, and their speculation was as it applied to the western and southwestern and southern Corn Belt locales, and we've seen that, some general improvement to dryness and drought, no improvement, and that's probably going to be the story going forward of significance, at least in the longer term, in the parts of Iowa, Minnesota, Wisconsin. Not that it won't rain there, but I think it's going to be an ongoing categorical issue as we get deeper into the planting season. Hence, I think, and as I've been telling folks, there'll be probably better progress in those western and northwestern Corn Belt locales, and we're not really expecting a wet cycle in that particular area versus eastern and southern areas of the Corn Belt. But add it all up and compared to everything else, nothing should be really far off from the usual 5-year averages. So before we lay the groundwork here, just like when you build an equipment shed, you got to dig out the trenches, you got to put the foundation in, then you just frame it up and up you go. That's the way we kind of do forecasting around here, getting into the short term of it all, medium range, and then we'll take a look at the longer range. We have both the Weather Service's perspective and the weather guy here from This Week in Agribusiness, our perspective around here. Been doing this 30 years. I think we still doing an okay job on it from our mindset. Anyway, back to these squiggly line charts here, the green lines, just steering currents. The winds kind of run along them from west to east where you get dips. Those are troughs where you get winds that kind of climb up into a ridging position. That's a ridge, obviously, and the troughs are associated with unsettled weather, the ridges with fair weather. And you can see a system here moving out of the plains and the desert southwest, that low coming up through the central and Great Plains into the upper Midwest, western Great Lakes region. And those winds that run from southwest to northeast are usually an indicator that we have not only wet weather, but maybe some severe weather. So some of those drought areas for Nebraska and Kansas and Oklahoma, Missouri into Iowa, there is some hope here in the next 4 to 6 days of some meaningful rainfall. That's at least the upper air perspective. And if you kind of put it onto the standard nomenclature, weather map and chart that most everyone else tends to look at, whether it's on our TV show or anywhere else, heaven forbid. But this is at least the general consensus to what the models are thinking there. And overall, it plays out like this with the overall scenario of low, deep low, that wound up L, the way the lines are packed together out of the plains and Corn Belt locales. And that's a pretty significant low that makes its way into the Canadian Prairie. And right on the heels of that one, here comes another one out of the southwest into the plains and into the Great Lakes region. So we have here at least two significant moisture makers in the short term that will bring some meaningful rainfall. Again, probably some field work delays and idling in the eastern sections. Look at it as more drought relief. And there it is here in the next 5 to 7 days. Those shades of yellows and reds and purples and violets are all indicative of really probably a 2 to 4, maybe some isolated 5-inch rainfall totals into some of the worst drought areas of Nebraska, sections of Missouri, Iowa, and the mid-Mississippi Valley, and everyone else basically 1/2 to 1.5 inches worth of rain. You even get rain up near the Canadian border up towards the Sioux and probably back into the Nebraska Panhandle and the higher peaks of the Rockies and Pacific Northwest. There'll be some ongoing snow at the highest levels out there. So Sarah, at least in the shorter range here, the medium range over the next 5 to 7 days, meaningful, significant rains for where we need them. The Western Corn Belt locales, probably some early season field work delays still going forward in the wet areas of Michigan, Indiana, and Ohio. But again, not the way the whole springtime planting season goes as we see it here across the Corn Belt locales.
I am muted.
Yeah.
maybe, maybe you did that. No,
I hope not. I hope not. So
seems,
something flinched on my end, and I didn't want to touch
right.
anything. So,
no, it seems these days that when it rains, it really rains. I mean, it just like we get a lot of rain. Maybe it's just me thinking that, but I don't know if there's any difference in, if we're seeing that or what.
No, that's an excellent observation, and we try to convey that. As we move out of these mid to late winter cycles and this El Nino setup, and we move into something a little more typical of springtime, the rains tend to take on, these little more clustered, what we say in and out, on and off, early and late night, early morning, late afternoon, early evening, pulsating is another way we call them in the weather business, versus what we call linear, where you can see on a radar chart today from Indiana, Ohio, back into Missouri. It's a wide corridor. So those rains do take on a different character as we get into the springtime season. So your observation is correct. We've had these wide and general and complete coverage outbreaks of moisture. They'll tend to be a little more spotty and scattered and sporadic in their coverages. And that is what builds windows, as we call them, windows of opportunity in the field work and planning for a lot of folks. Some folks will get a nice rain and get numerous examples in central Illinois where you'll get rain out at Jacksonville, you get to Champaign and Danville, and there'll be nothing going on, or you'll reverse course. And that's really an example of what plays out across the Midwest of the plains as we get deeper into May and June. And there's a typical rule of thumb as well. If you're not getting any significant moisture in the plains, Kansas, Nebraska, Oklahoma, by about the 15th of May, it takes on more or less a Mediterranean climate, hit and miss pop up. And that's why you're not able, unless you get a tropical system in, to get any organized rains going in those plain states areas, particularly the drought areas of the central and southern winter wheat belt. And so that's something as well that does need to be watched later on the season.
So what else is ahead?
All right, going ahead forward here onto the maps and charts we go. Again, back to the squiggly lines. This is out 2 weeks in advance. Southwest wind flow up aloft here in the next actually 6 to 10 days. That'll take us here into the early part of May. A little dip in the steering currents. The trough, if you will, is in the western reaches of the continent. The ridge is over the eastern third of the United States. And that southwest wind flow is not terribly strong, tends to weaken this time of the year. We then kind of keep an eye on these numbers, these bottom lines, as weather forecasters take a look at how high and how thick and how tall a certain level of the atmosphere is. In wintertime, it's compacted. In summertime, it expands. When you expand the atmosphere, that's a relation to warming. And the more you can expand the atmosphere, the more it weighs, and the more it sinks, and the hotter it gets. So we tend to keep an eye on the numbers, these 588 and 582 numbers that come out of the southern states. So commodity guys models know when you're talking about 582 or 588 or something above 600, because they know then there's heat and there's a heat wave weather pattern coming. In any event, here's warmth. Things continue to move along. This is the National Weather Service's 6 to 10 day outlook here through early May, and we got no problems with this here. It ought to be a nice, delightful go of it for whatever you have going on out tending to livestock. Corn Belt locales. So the warmth continues on away from this late season chill that's really prevailed during much of the early springtime season. Moisture as well, really focused in what we think may be one of the few and far between outbreaks of moisture this springtime season for Minnesota, really centered there, the upper Midwest, the upper Mississippi Valley. And this is sort of a benign, somewhat above average, slightly above average, they're thinking in the way of moisture for the Plain States and Corn Belt locale. So a little more showery, we could probably put it that way. The more significant rains where we absolutely need them in the upper Midwest and Pacific Northwest. And if you were to go further here, the 6 to 10 day through almost the first week of May, very little change. The overall movement of what we call the large scale features, the what we call full latitude troughs or ridges, areas of the jet stream that take up numerous states or a wide area of the country or the hemisphere, is still slow to move. The trough is in the western part of the country, the ridge in the eastern part. That bottom line creeps a little farther north, so we would expect, well, there's still some heat to go and contend with here. So there's some warmth, significant warmth, and probably we've seen already actually a couple of 90-degree days in Nebraska, the Ozarks, Oklahoma Panhandle. Wouldn't be surprised that transpires. So where there's ongoing dryness and drought, and you haven't had much recharge, I can see how winter wheat quality is going to worsen a little bit. Meanwhile, this is sort of again, very benign look. These maps and charts are nice to lay some groundwork and framing to them, but they don't really tell you a whole lot. Okay, above average moisture. Well, what kind of rainfall? Is it all at once? Is it spread out over a week? Typically, Sarah, over the course of a week in mid to late April, early mid May, and this is from the folks of the Illinois State Water Survey, at least as it applies to that corridor of the Corn Belt, let's say Iowa, northern Missouri, northern and central Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, let's say north of I-70, it's about a half to a little shy of 3/4 of an inch is a normal amount of rain. We keep stats on everything: humidity, pressure, temperatures, wind. Well, we do the same thing with rainfall. And so if you come up with something that may seem, wet to you, a half to 3/4 of an inch for a producer or for someone trying to plant, if you're even keeled in soil moisture, great. If it's wet already to begin with, well, that's like the end of the world. If it's dryness and drought, well, thank goodness it's crop saving $1 million rain that some folks need. So basically, that's the scenario that the feds are thinking around here as we move on through the next 6 to 10 to 18 or 10 to 15 days. Wetter, showery is another way they perceive it. And again, some significant moisture where we need it across the upper Midwest and parts of the northern plains.
Should be able to get some crops in the ground looking at that.
Yeah,
I would think, at least in that eastern part of the Corn Belt.
Yeah. And again, a lot of producers tend to pull this stuff up, off the internet and look at it, and that's it. And it can take an assessment and go from there. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. There's so many means, and all that model data is floating around on the internet to begin with anyway, and sometimes in good hands and sometimes in loose hands. It gets slapped up there on X, Twitter, whatever they call it these days, and you
Right.
go from there. And I look at it. I used to respond to every little thing I see on there. I just don't do it anymore, So that's why you got to check us out on the TV show or listen to us on radio or these podcasts that we do once a month.
Yeah, because this gets overwhelming. That's for sure.
Oh yes.
Yeah.
Oh yes.
Yeah.
Even for the guy that's been doing it 30 years. So
All right, let's look a little farther out. I think you've got some more forecasts for us here.
Well, this is the stuff that stuff that folks may begin to realize. Hey, we've seen these. This is the format we like to lay out here, and our thinking here for the last week of April and two jet stream patterns. We're trying to represent that in an El Nino setup there are two branches to the jet, the main polar branch of the jet, which remains so far and much of the winter season up to our north, and a little separate sliver of jet stream winds, southern branch, if you will, subtropical jet, however you want to label it, over the southern states. In any event, because of cloud cover and some moisture, and there's one more of these El Nino systems to come out of the southern plains. We see that here over the late portion last week of this month of April. The warmth, we think, is going to move a little farther north, the center of it through the upper Midwest. Not much of a change you're thinking from what we've seen and talked about already across the plains and the Corn Belt locales. And still a pretty stormy weather pattern. There's at least one or two more systems to make a run into California. I believe the water equivalency back at the beginning part of April off the Sierra, if you were to take the snowpack and melt it down to put it into a rain gauge, was about 25 to 30 inches. It's only the second time since 2015, I believe, that they've had an above average moisture season in California. Well, I know there's probably folks who are watching us here for plain states and cattle and corn and soybean coverage. Well, you know, that moisture off the Sierra is the main and virtually only integral part of moisture source they get for the irrigation operations in the San Joaquin, Sacramento valleys. So it's a big deal when they get a significant winter season of moisture in the West. So one more of those to come. There's great runoff prospects in the western states. Look at the moisture for the northern and central through eastern Corn Belt locales. Some stormy weather as well. We had these storms that tend to flare up in the late night and early morning. Well, it may tend to be common as well, where you necessarily don't really want to have to be talking about those. A lot of folks obviously are asleep when some of those watches and warnings play on out. So that's what's left of April. Now, more importantly, that is a dramatic pattern shift, and it kind of deviates what the feds are thinking. And we are in a very good confidence. So we do have a little low, but some cool air. Matter of fact, in the short term, probably another frost. We've had a couple of frosts, late season frost, non-damaging it as they apply to corn and soybeans because there's nothing that's come up. Ornamentals have taken, and some flowers, trees, and that type of thing have taken a little bit of a burn back into the south and southeastern part of the country. But another low, but some cool air moving into the eastern Great Lakes, the northeastern New England, that warm ridge, if you will, fancy $25, 25 cent, whatever you want to put a label on it, word for retrograding. Weather actually will back up from east to west. Normally moves from west to east. You can actually watch the upper pattern shift back west. And so we have kind of a drop to more seasonal temperatures, a little cooling of soils over the eastern Corn Belt, warming into the western sections. And, that's just the way it is. And more importantly, two approaches here, kind of a Jekyll and Hyde approach. Well, we're back into this drier scenario for the upper Midwest, the Great Lakes region. So these next couple of systems that come through, that's probably going to do it, I think, at least through mid-May, with getting some recharge of significance out of Minnesota, the Dakotas, Wisconsin. Dry weather in Michigan, much needed. Indiana as well. Same with Ohio, and it's more normalized. Think in terms of about a quarter to maybe 3/4 of an inch of moisture each week. Let's say through this is about roughly 2.5 to 3 weeks of data here. So, maybe another inch and a half worth of rain into parts of the plains and western and southern Corn Belt locales. That's normal. That's typical. That's average for this point in spring and May. There's, again, bulk moisture in two areas, the southern plains, Texas, Oklahoma, southwestern parts of the country, and down Florida ways as well. Going forward from there, late May, another pattern reversal. We're seeing signs, as we talked about in the opening of the broadcast here, Sarah, that yes, El Nino in bits and pieces will begin to get underway, will begin to move back into a more neutral, typical, normal state of the atmosphere. And there you have it, a little cool air up towards the Sioux and Sault Ste. Marie, more normalized temperatures across the plains and Corn Belt locales, warmth in the west and over the southeastern part of the country. That jet stream pattern, that look at the maps and charts for temperatures, that's kind of normal. That's a typical late May look there. And here's a quick snapshot on May precip. Some dry time is, not great for Wisconsin and Minnesota, and thinking there'll be better progress numbers coming in each week in the upper Midwest, northern parts of the Corn Belt. There's welcome moisture from the Black Hills down through Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma. Good news. I think we're probably getting, at least at this point, maybe some heading winter wheat in the plains, and more moisture. They'll take it anytime they can get it over the south and southeastern part of the country. Maybe a little more disease and insect pressure down there. So at least through late May, Sarah, all in all, if you were to average it out, there's just not a lot of big headlines. It's just it's spring. It's a winding down of El Nino. Some folks are going to get at it some weeks. Others are going to be a little slow to get at it. But as a whole, again, at least through late May and meteorological springtime, nothing going on of big time historic 5-year, 10-year averages. We should be able to make progress here on an even keel basis here in the weeks to come.
Nothing too exciting. What about for summer, though? You got us through spring. You got a peek at what's ahead then?
Yeah, we certainly do. Here's most of June. And again, we've got a couple of lobes. Again, this is the re-emergence of the cool Canadian high that typically ebbs and flows back and forth into the northern and central Corn Belt and Plains, sometimes to the Ohio. Then it moves back to the Canadian Prairie. And that's when we get inclement weather to happen. And then that bubble high moves back southward. And we're just back and forth between this main jet stream pattern. And so most of June, you may have some swings of temperature, but they're going to be pretty much normalized, I would expect, with crop emergence and growth and comfort for livestock and feed requirements and all that. No big headlines. We talked about those bottom numbers on those upper charts. They don't look to be getting out of control, at least as it applies to getting through a good part of the month of June. And precip as well. Not great news into, the central and southern parts of the winter wheat belt. Once again, you get past that magic date of about the 15th to 20th of May. If you don't have anything going on in the moisture department, maybe out of luck going forward from there. There may be a tendency for the eastern Corn Belt, Ohio Valley to be a little bit wetter, that is, but nothing out of control. And more importantly, the tropics as well, with still some strong winds. They're running better than 15, 20 knots above average over the Gulf Coast. They'll probably stay that way at least into June with El Nino in charge. So the tropics are going to stay pretty quiet as well. Remember last year, matter of fact, it was down in Florida back in the Florida Keys, late March, Sarah, and they had so much loss of live coral reef down there at 95 to 100 degree water temperatures in the Gulf of Mexico and parts of the far southwestern Atlantic because of those hot highs. Well, here we are into July. We'll get you through July. And our next get together, we'll take a look at the remainder of the summertime season and a sneak peek into the tropics as well. But here you go. The standard little trough, the bending, the U shape is in the middle part of the country. Cool air to the north, some warmth and heat to the west and southeastern part of the country. Open up a textbook. Guess what? That's what you see normally in July. And moisture maybe a little more beneficial for parts of the plains. That would be a bit of an anomaly, but we're trending back again out of an anomaly to something more normalized. And this could be maybe some indication that El Nino or La Nina cooling of the waters in the Central Pacific may begin to take hold. And there may be some tendency for maybe a wetter scenario, at least into July, returning south of I-70 into the far southern and southeastern Corn Belt. And no worse, Sarah, than normal moisture for the upper Midwest. Now, again, caveat to that, you're in a drought. You're probably going to stay in a drought. So there may be some subsoil moisture related issues going there. And we'll keep an eye on some dryness out through the northwestern part of the country. So that is pretty much the thinking around here, that, we've got some delays in some eastern Corn Belt locales, a little more progress west. We've got some issues of dryness and drought. I don't see any worsening of what you got going on now. There ought to be a continuation of some progress. There will be progress to be made here, particularly as we get through the month of May and early June. I don't have any big headlines about any great laggards in the planning department. And going forward from there with a little heat, some timely rains, there should not be any big ongoing headlines with corn and soybeans or cattle operations for that matter, really anywhere in the plains and Corn Belt locales. So keep an eye on the Canadian Prairie. That's going to be a different story. Dryness and drought not going to remedy itself here till later this fall. We think in the upper Midwest, the Dakotas, and far northern plains. And that's pretty much the story. We'll keep updating this each week on This Week in Agribusiness and that 4-week forecast, and we'll get together next month, I'm sure.
Very good. Yeah. So you think those red dots there in Iowa that we keep seeing, I know they're getting smaller, but you think those aren't going to be a big issue, right, going forward?
Yeah, we call it categorical improvement because you go from extreme down to an exceptional to maybe a moderate to slightly dry. So it's not going to happen overnight. Sometimes when you do get those, and we saw that in Texas. We saw that in some areas of the country last year, the plains of the Midwest. You get all these rains that come down all at once at 5 to 7 inches in a couple of days worth of time. Well, yeah, technically in the drought, but half of it's running off in the fields, and half of it your tile lines are running crazy, and so is your seed down there too. So, in any event, it should be more of an even keeled winding down, not a complete ending here. And again, some enough moisture to keep us going around here, and we don't think there'll be any large scale, long lasting heat, at least into early summer. Mid to late summer here. We'll tease the next broadcast when how La Nina plays out and the development of that here later on the summer and fall season.
Very good. We'll touch base with you again next month, Greg. Appreciate your insight and your forecast.
Thank you. Always a pleasure to get together with you here.
We also appreciate all of you tuning in and spending time with us. A reminder that all Feedstuffs 365 segments are available at feedstuffs.com. So you can go in and watch those archives or share them with your colleagues if you'd like to do that. And don't forget, Greg is on each week on This Week in Agribusiness, so you can catch him between our segments if you want to follow him every week there. Until next time, for Feedstuffs 365, I'm Sarah Muirhead.